All right, I believe we are live. So welcome everybody to our panel discussion. My name is Andy Littlejohn and I'm the chief of the Epicenter Energy Incubator and Accelerator and today's moderator. I hope that you all enjoyed the special screening of the food episode of the PBS and Amazon Prime documentary series, The Power Trip, The Story of Energy. I know that every time I watch this episode, I feel like I learned something new. So I'm so excited to be able to moderate today's discussion, which features experts on food, energy, and innovation, so that we can unpack some of the challenges and trends that were explored in this episode. Before I introduce our panelists, I do want to let our audience know that you all can submit questions to our panelists through the platform's chat feature. I will be keeping an eye on the chat, so just make sure to submit your questions as they arise. And I do have just one more piece of housekeeping. I know my social media team would be upset with me if I did not take a screenshot of our panelists before getting started. So panelists, please bear with me while I take a screenshot of us all. So I'm going to count to 3 and then take a screenshot. So if everybody can just smile. 1, 2, 3. Thank you for indulging me. So now that we have some of the housekeeping out of the way, I'm going to go ahead and get started by introducing today's panelists. Joining us today, we have Dr. Michael E. Weber, who is the author of the book, Power Trip, The Story of Energy. He is also the professor of mechanical engineering at the University of Texas at Austin, and also serves as the Chief Science and Technology Officer for ENGIE. So Dr. Weber, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
We also have Cheryl Kirschenbaum joining us. Cheryl is the co-director of Michigan State University's Food Literacy and Engagement Poll, and is also the host of Serving Up Science on PBS Digital Studios. Welcome, Cheryl.
Thanks, Andy.
We also have Dr. Cliff Zentgraf joining us. Dr. Zentgraf is the Chief Learning Officer for the San Antonio Museum of Science and Technology and is also the Program Chair for SA Smart. Welcome, Dr. Zentgraf.
Thank you, Andy. It's a pleasure to be here.
And finally, we have Eric Cooper joining us, who is the President and CEO of the San Antonio Food Bank. So welcome, Eric. All right, so I have to say I feel really honored to be moderating this Rockstar panel, and I'm excited to go ahead and get started. So with that, let's jump in. Michael, I would like to start with you. It must have been really fascinating to look at food waste and food insecurity through your energy lens. So were there any big surprises or things that you learned that you didn't expect through exploring food's connection to energy?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the thing that's most surprising for me that I learned that continues to amaze me is the amount of food waste we have in food abundant parts of the world. At the same time, the way of food insecurity you just mentioned in other parts of the world. So there are parts of the world where there's not enough food, or people don't have easy enough access to the food, or it's too expensive, or it spoils too quickly, or whatever it is. There's a challenge with not enough food. And then in the richer parts of the world, the United States or United Kingdom or France or wherever it is, there's so much food and we have an abundance of food, we end up wasting a significant fraction. And that waste is something like 25 to 50% of the food. And that's just an amazing amount, just the amount of food we throw away. And if you go back hundreds of years, how precious that food would have been considered. And then to assess the amount of energy embedded in that edible food we throw away, and that's a lot of energy too. That's enough energy to run entire countries or improve people's lives. And so I'm always struck by the waste. And there's waste all over the system. We waste water, we waste energy, our cars waste energy, all those things. But it feels like the waste for food is more morally complicated because food is such a necessity for life. So I'm really struck by that. I continue to be blown away by that.
Yeah, I think that really struck me as well as how food is so interconnected to energy. And on some level I feel like people know about that, but to kind of scratch away and peel away those layers through your book and through the documentary episode was just really fascinating. So thank you. So Cheryl, I want to ask a question to you. There was a lot of discussion in this episode about the impact of people being disconnected from their food and its production process. I know that I certainly have experienced that where, you go to a grocery store or a restaurant and, pick up some food and, you just don't really think about where it comes from. But we heard a lot about some of the negative impacts of that disconnection. And I know that you do a lot of work around food literacy and food engagement. So can you talk about some of the trends that you're seeing in these areas and the impact of those trends?
Sure. We are more removed than ever before from the agricultural practices that sustain us. And what I mean by that is today, less than 2% of Americans live on farms as more people move away from rural areas into the suburbs and the city. And so what we see in our polling at Michigan State University is that about half of Americans say they never or rarely even seek information about where their food was produced or how it was grown. And as a result, we don't really understand the connections between how the food's produced, our health, the environment, and all the pieces that we talk about in the film Power Trip. And so, we see things like over a third of the US doesn't understand that all food contains genes, right? So we have these big policy discussions about food security, and the public has been largely left out of them. And so when we talk about finding solutions, many people assume that we need to invent something new or it's time for this grand innovation, when many of the solutions to our greatest challenges are dependent upon things that we can do right now in agriculture and with the way that we produce and use and waste food.
Yeah, it reminds me of one of the quotes that I really love from the episode, which is, "We can't invent our way out of this." And I think that was very poignant because innovation and invention is definitely a part of the process, but you can't rely on that solely and not do anything else to help address the issues. So that's really interesting. So Eric, I want to switch over to you and ask a question about things that we can do locally. So this episode addressed food from a global perspective, but I really want to look at food and food insecurity locally here in San Antonio. So what can you share with us about food insecurity in San Antonio specifically?
Yeah, Andy, thank you so much. And congratulations, Michael, on this great, important work. I've been at this for about 28 years. And really, when you think about the food insecurity rates here in our community, we feed about 120,000 people a week. We go through about a semi-truckload of food every hour. And the thought that any precious calorie would be going to waste, trying to prevent waste while feeding families, is really the core work of Feeding America food banks around the country. The big barriers to good nutrition: income, how much you make determines how well you eat; geography, where you live. Do you live in a food desert? Do you have access? Education. Do you know how to prepare food? Can you cook the vegetables that you have? And then commerce, right? It's such a weird environment where unhealthy food sometimes can be more affordable, taste really good, but be really bad for us. And so really trying to shape the food environment to try to make sure families get nourishment. I think what people could be doing is just extending more compassion. Hunger is a symptom of a bigger issue, which is poverty. People in poverty have lots of issues. Someone that's hungry just has one. You have to have a tandem approach to move people forward, give them the fish while teaching them how to fish. Ultimately, to learn more, go to our website, safoodbank.org, to give food time through volunteerism, always financial support, and then raising your voice. Participate in the Mayor's Smart City Challenge. We need more people at the table if we're going to find the solutions and the strategy. Ultimately, it's willpower. I think good, effective policy could go a long way in curbing how many people are food insecure here in our community and making sure everyone's nourished.
Thank you, Eric, and kudos to you and all the work that you do. 120,000 a week, that's phenomenal. So once again, to any of our audience members who are looking for ways to support or get involved in the San Antonio Food Bank and helping to fight food insecurity locally, the website again was safoodbank.org. So thank you, Eric.
Thank you.
So Cliff, I want to move to you. So we saw some really cool innovations in this episode, and I have to say that was one of my favorite parts. Was learning about the innovative coding that Appeal is developing, and learning about some of the innovations in vertical farming. All that stuff was really neat. But you and I both know that a great idea doesn't automatically have an impact, and that innovators really have to put in a lot of hard work and a lot of elbow grease to not only develop their innovation, but bring it to market. So can you talk a little bit about the path to commercialization after an innovator has that light bulb moment?
Yeah, I'd be glad to do that. Let me start with a special welcome to our SA Smart Challenge teams and students, grades 7 to 12, taking time to learn about this topic. So use the word commercialization, Andy, and that's a big word, right? And what it really means is just taking an idea and figuring out how to bring it to life in a practical way, and to keep it alive in a practical way where you can build it and grow it, and you've got the people and the money that you need to make it happen. And in the school of innovation that I come from, the first step that we encourage people who have an idea to do is to write it down, to take that idea and put your fingers on the keyboard and see if you can articulate that idea, and that in itself will help you think it through. And then take the thing you've written and send it to 3 or 4 or 5 people who they don't have to be the world's expert. They could be Dr. Weber, they could be Eric Cooper, but they don't have to be. Those are busy guys. So maybe someone who knows a little bit more than you do about food and energy. And then when you do that, don't be in sales mode. Don't be in a mode where you're already trying to convince people that you know how to do it. You want to be true to the idea, but really listen to what people are telling you, both technically, how to make it work, and also whether people would really use it. I mean, the world is full of entrepreneurs who have built something that nobody wants. And so you really need to address both sides of that topic. The whole episode is a wonderful example of that, how we are disconnected from how our food works. And there was a particular point in the episode where it talked about growing, transporting, cooling, cooking, and delivering food. And, if you are somebody who's got an idea about how to address food insecurity in San Antonio, our SA Smart Challenge, you're going to have to touch all of those probably, even if you're only focused on one part. If you're going to make food, you got to know how to preserve it until it gets into the hands of the people who are going to eat it. So, I think that would be a way to engage. Again, for our SA Smart participants, I heard great ideas about preserving food waste, nutritional value, meal kits, growing food at home, preserving food like the Appeal solution, vertical farming. That might be hard at home, but, lots of things they can think about. And if you happen to be here and you don't know about the SA Smart Challenge, allow me to say www.sa-smart.org. We are open to registrations from 7th to 12th graders.
Fantastic. Thank you, Cliff. And
Thank you.
yeah, you beat me to my next question, which was how can audience members get engaged in different innovation efforts? And so you said it, check out the 2021 SA Smart Challenge. And get involved if you're a student, as a team member, or even as a mentor. I know you're looking for mentors as well.
We're very interested in recruiting mentors, yes.
Fantastic. And I love what you said about starting by articulating your idea, as an innovator, and working in our incubator and accelerator with innovators and startups. That, I have to say, is one of the biggest challenges that we see with innovators, is just being able to effectively communicate the value of their idea and the impact of their idea. And one thing that I just want to throw out as an exercise that we take our startups through is we actually ask them to start by drawing their idea without any words, and it is so difficult to do, but it really helps you kind of distill down the essence of the idea. And so I love that starting with our articulation is really
I believe someone that Dr. Weber and I both are familiar with, Dr. George Kosmetsky, used to say that if you can't draw it, you don't understand it.
Exactly. And it's so interesting too, when you have teams of people working on the same idea, how differently they'll draw out or articulate their, the same concept and the same idea. So.
Indeed.
Awesome. Well, we've had some questions come in through the chat, so I want to move to some of those. So we had quite a few questions around community gardens. So this question comes from our good friend Steffi. So she asked, why don't we encourage schools and neighborhoods to start community gardens? It seems a teachable way to harvest conversations. So do one of our panelists want to take that question on?
I'm happy to lean in a little bit here, Andy. I know through the San Antonio Food Bank, we've helped to build about 100 different community gardens throughout the city, hosting one of the largest urban farms here on site at the San Antonio Food Bank. I think this is a great way to cultivate, some conversation, some crops, and really spur education and awareness. So if you haven't been out to see your San Antonio Food Bank's urban farms, we have about 25 acres here on campus, and then an additional 50 acres at Mission San Juan, part of the original Mission District. There's the Sakia that the missionaries built. You just got to go out and see it. We restored that 300-year-old dormant fallow land back to be producing food that's feeding our community. Chickens, goats, hydroponics, aquaponics, a lot going on. But I do think getting people out to understand the concept of reaping what they sow and sowing what they reap, getting a little garden started in either porch, backyard, edible landscape. If we're going to plant a tree, might as well do some work for us. Have, nuts, fruit, lots of ways that people can grow food.
Awesome, thank you. And there's another question that's kind of tied to this, which is, what about community composting programs? That question comes from Jill. Do we have any, you mentioned some of the community gardens that we have here in San Antonio. Are there community composting programs out there?
There is an organization, their name escapes me, that's doing some great work around composting. We teach several different forms of just kind of residential composting. New Earth is obviously a big champion of composting here in our community, but maybe one of the other panelists might know.
We have an unsophisticated form of community composting, which is the landfill today. We throw our food waste and other organic matter into the trash. It goes by the trash trucks to the landfill. The landfill breaks it down slowly, and the food waste is released as methane eventually in the atmosphere, which is not a good way to do it. We can either capture that gas and use it for energy, capture the food waste beforehand to intentionally turn it into biogas. We could compost more locally to our home and use the remainder, the solids, as a soil amendment. There are other things we could do. My wife and I were just talking the other day, maybe we can get chickens, because they can eat the rinds or leftover food scraps. Chickens are a great way to take the waste into some other useful thing, which is the life of the chicken, or meat or eggs and that kind of thing. So there is a bad community composting, which is the landfill. Certainly there are better ways to go about it than that.
Thank you. And yeah, there's some activity in the chat. I see there's the Green Spaces Alliance, which administers a network of community gardens in San Antonio. And then also there's mention of something called Compost Queens as well. So it might be interesting to check out. So I now want to, Michael, this question is going to be for you. There was some discussion in the chat early on about where people made some connections between some of the shots that were taken in France of the documentary, and they said it looks like Texas. And so I'm curious if you can just kind of talk to that, about any of the similarities, geographically between France and Texas, and how that, any similarities when it comes to, the food and agriculture as well.
Yeah, so there are some overlaps in similarities. So the Brittany coast or Normandy of France look very different than Texas, and the Alps look very different. But in the south of France, where it's more like a hilly terrain, hot and sunny with shorter shrubbery, not the tall trees. It looks kind of like Texas. And I happened to travel through France when I was 12 and lived in France when I was 15 for a while because my father was a professor and we were on sabbatical. I remember thinking that the south of France in many parts, the south central interior part, looks like Texas. And this is offensive to both Texans and French, by the way, to say that there might be similarities in the climate and the kind of in the approach. The language slows down as you go further south, as it does in the South United States, this kind of thing. But there are some agricultural similarities. In fact, Texas saved the French wine industry. In the middle of the 1800s, there was a bug, the aphid, that was destroying the vines and the wine plants and the grape plants, all these things in France. And it was a crisis. And there was actually sort of a botanist in Texas who had developed a form of the grape plants that was resistant to this pest, and it was transplanted and rebuilt the French wine industry. And so when I talk about the multi-billion-dollar French wine industry, I like to remind my French colleagues that they have Texan agriculture to thank for that. And they're not really sure what to make of that comment. But it's a really fascinating story that this botanist and biologist from Dallas and Temple, different parts of Central Texas, were able to revive agriculture in France because of that. So most French wine you're drinking is actually from Texas roots of grape plants, which is grapevine, which is kind of amazing.
Wow, that's a great story. I had no idea. So in addition to just the shots kind of, the shots looking similar, we have some deep ties.
There's a deep tie, and it's also just beautiful. And France has a different kind of culture of food. In the United States, it's more around cost and convenience and how can I get calories into my body faster, whereas the French are not in a hurry to eat. They're slower meals. They tend to be smaller portions, more courses, more variety. Veganism, gluten-free, a lot of the variations on diets we have in America are less common in France. The French have more of a philosophy that you eat whatever's put in front of you, that you're not allowed to be a picky eater or anything like that, or have sensitivities or allergies and this kind of thing. So American view on food is very different. Certainly Texas view is different as well.
Thank you. Yeah, Cheryl, that actually brings up a question to my mind, which is the food literacy and engagement poll. I assume that was just for the United States. Is that accurate?
Right. So we sample over 2,000 people every 6 months or so, and the data is weighted to represent the U.S. Census demographics.
Okay, I was just curious about how food, the differences and food literacy and engagement. I wonder, to Michael's point about how they kind of consume food differently and approach meals differently in other countries. I was wondering if you knew about any trends in some of the other countries and how they kind of compare to the U.S.
Oh, I love that question because I think about this all the time, especially as a parent. As Michael just said, there are a lot of different attitudes about food aversions. So I look at my kids who go to every restaurant and see a kid's meal that has basically French fries, pizza, spaghetti, and some combination. And they think that's kids' food. And if you go to different parts of Europe or elsewhere in Japan, in China, it's much more varied because that's just the anticipated, that's just what the culture tells kids is normal. So I wish we had a little more of that. And then, of course, in the US, I know Michael talks a lot about how we have these all-you-can-eat buffets, which aren't only here, but are definitely more Central American culture than we see other places. And of course, that relates to how we waste food, what we have left over, and what doesn't get distributed to the people who really need it. So I see kind of lots of ways to think about that. But also interesting, even here, just in the US, we see dramatic differences in attitudes based on age. So we see in our polling, millennials and Gen Z are really excited about so many plant-based meat alternatives. Many of them have already tried eating them and plan to eat them all the time, whereas we see 65 plus a little more hesitant to consider culture-based meats and plant-based meats. And when you think about kind of where we're headed, if the younger Americans are representative of what's going to be popular 10, 20, 30 years out, we are going to be shifting away from meat, most likely in some regard.
Wow, that's really interesting. Thank you. So I have another question that I want to open up to our panelists, which is, what does our community need to do to prevent food insecurity? And is it all tied to jobs? And Eric, this question was posed to you, but I'd like to open it up to all of our panelists. So is food insecurity primarily tied to jobs?
Well, I'll just go first and just throw some thought in there that, Yeah, I mean, obviously, I mentioned the four big barriers. And so sometimes we see in a crisis like a natural disaster, people that have resources are going hungry. They don't have access to food, water, those basic elements. And so it's not always, but I'd say significantly the food insecurity issue in the United States is tied to people's income. And then geography plays a huge role in just access to a traditional grocery store. Do you have transportation, right? Kind of the trunk phenomena. If you have a trunk, that dictates maybe the price you're paying and the varieties of food that you can get. I met a woman that her children had never eaten watermelon, and she just said, because I ride the bus, I mean, carrying a watermelon home was just logistically impossible. So I do think that food is a basic need. It's what all humans need. I thought Michael did a great job of kind of casting the lens, right? The phrase of, if you grew up poor, your parents probably asked you, did you get enough to eat after a meal? If you grew up middle income, it was probably more about the taste. If you were privileged, it was more about the presentation, the experience, color, texture. But at the end of the day, this is energy. This is what our bodies need if they're going to grow healthy and strong. And we need to do a better job of making sure people have access to those basic ingredients.
I think I'd like to share a comment here. I'm not a member of your panel because I'm an expert on the nexus of food, water, and energy. But how students can relate to this, and I see a common theme. The episode talked about the interconnectedness of all the elements of the system. We're in our fourth year of the SA Smart Challenge, and our first 3 years, our topics were transportation, sustainability of the environment, and digital inclusion last year. And every one of those topics relates to the question that was just asked, the watermelon story, right? How can people get to the store and get back? And how do we do that when there's going to be 1.1 million more people in San Antonio by 2040? All of these things are so connected to one another, and to improve the quality of life in our city, we're going to have to address them all. And we're going to have to do it in an equitable way that brings all corners of the city along for the ride.
Hey, Andy, I really do want viewers to know, if you know someone or if you are struggling with food insecurity, to please go to our website at safoodbank.org. If you lack access, then you can call our helpline, 210-431-8326. But if you know anyone or if you're experiencing food insecurity, there's resources to help through local food banks and food pantries, connectivity to federal safety nets like SNAP and WIC. But more needs to be done. It's not adequate, but it's a place to start.
Yes, thank you, Eric, for sharing that information. That kind of leads me actually into the next question, where you said more definitely needs to be done in this area. So this question is for Cheryl and Eric. What are some of the public policy considerations for elevating food scarcity and resources both nationally and locally?
Please, Cheryl.
Well, I'll start and you can jump in anytime. I think there's a lot of ways to answer this. If we learned anything, well, we learned so much from Power Trip, but one of these big pieces, right, is that all of these different parts of our culture and society are connected to food. And so Eric was just talking about access, supporting public programs, supporting more public transportation. So something we see here, I live right next to Lansing, Michigan, and we're not just seeing with the pandemic more issues with people who can't afford food getting access to food. We're seeing a lot more challenges for the elderly and for the disabled who suddenly don't have the same ability to reach out and get the support they're used to. So I think there are a lot of programs to help people get access, to support community places and spaces where people can get access to food and reach. And what I mean is, sometimes we think we can solve a food desert just by popping a grocery store somewhere, when there are a lot of social factors that will still limit people from getting to those spaces, and making decisions not just at the national level, but locally. Because I think shining a spotlight on this with our own city councils can really do a lot to say, you know, these aren't just other people, these are people living with us in our community that need our support. And then that paints a very different picture of who's in need and who we can help.
Yeah, and I tell you, our nation's safety net again is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, which is formerly food stamps. I would love that it's rebranded, so to speak, as the NAP program, right? The Nutrition Assistance Program. Supplemental doesn't provide enough nourishment to feed someone for the 30-day period. Doctors wouldn't write a script with an inadequate prescription, right? You want to make sure people get the nourishment, and you know, it's dependent on the individual having a job. And right now in this COVID-19 crisis, with so many Americans out of work, the food stamp program, SNAP, just doesn't provide enough. Congress has done some work with the stimulus to increase it by 15%, but more needs to be done. I think that I'm more of a carrot person, maybe because of my connection to food, than a stick person. But I do think that challenging the industry by way of incentives or penalties to reduce the waste. I mean, grocers hear me all the time. I'm the only truck at the back of a grocery store that's not paid to be there. I am leveraging philanthropy to rescue that food that's a surplus. And I feel privileged to get it so that I could feed needy families. But I think we need to start thinking more creatively. We need to start thinking about, you know, how do we incentivize or, you know, again, scrutinize those offenders that we should not waste this precious resource, which is food. I think of the, you know, reduce, reuse, recycle, right? You know, using our land and our environment in the most strategic way to grow what we need. And then just thinking about how do you reuse things? How do you find homes? You know, that chicken story, right? And then, you know, recycle. How do we put things back into play? And I think we all need to be better stewards over the resources we've been blessed. And I think we've just been so fortunate that we've gotten a little careless.
And if I could real quick just add on, because I'd be remiss with everything Eric said, I think right now, given the conditions around the COVID pandemic, programs that support women, really finding ways to keep women in the workforce, because women are often the primary caregivers. They're losing their jobs at unprecedented, we're losing our jobs, I guess, at unprecedented rates. I feel very fortunate to still be working, but we're staying home with kids. We're the ones who are leaving the workforce and then losing that income to support our families. And oftentimes single parents as well. So there's a lot being discussed at the federal level to increase incentives to support programs that are going to keep women working. But I think that's something really critical we can do right now.
I have another quick chance here to connect this to SA Smart. When students show up at SAMSAT or virtual SAMSAT in order to deliver their final presentations, the 10 finalists, there's three kinds of things they're going to talk about. Either a product, like, you know, could be some kind of particular packaging of a food, or a service. And this is, Eric, what reminded me of this is thinking of the truck at the back of the store, right? It could be some kind of service that is being provided, or a strategy. You know, one thing we invite them to do is to talk about a strategy that would be interesting across the city or for their school district or in their school. And, you know, once again, it's all of these approaches. You know, it's not going to be one silver bullet, right? It's all of these things getting better across the board.
Fantastic. Thank you all. So I have another question, and this one comes from our friend Matt Haynes. So lots of Americans were alarmed by empty grocery store shelves during COVID. If this happens again, is there anything we've learned from that experience during early COVID that we can use to improve our energy just in time inventory for groceries?
That's a great question.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Eric.
Go ahead, Mike.
Okay, well, say I have the view from Paris and from Texas. Okay, I'll speak quickly and leave you a moment. They didn't have empty shelves in Paris the way we did in the United States. And there are two reasons for that. One is Paris shoppers don't shop that way. Parisians don't buy 4 weeks worth of anything. They shop much more often. They're often walking or riding the metro, to the same kind of thing as the watermelon store. They don't carry as much, but also they don't have the hoarding mentality that Americans do. So even if they were driving to the grocery store, they wouldn't buy as much. Secondly, the French supply chains for food tend to be shorter. They have more local food, more food grown within France, less food that travels the world's oceans to get to the destination. So shorter food supply chains and different shopping behaviors meant it was just a very different experience in France and the United States. But even in the United States, our food supply chains ended up being pretty robust. We didn't have great shortages of food. The shelves might have been empty, but I would say my two kids who are 18 and 21 who got jobs at a major national chain grocery store you would recognize right when COVID was happening, were laughing about this. They say people think we're running out of food, but actually it's just in the back of the store. They couldn't get it from the back of the store to the shelf fast enough, or from the truck to the back of the store. The supply chains actually were pretty robust for food. Where the supply chains were short was on the paper goods, toilet paper, paper towels, also some cleaning supplies you still can't get today. So, and that's just because those have great shelf life. And so people bought even more of the great shelf life stuff so they could hoard a year's worth. And that's the supply chain that really got hung up more so than the food supply chain. The food supply issues on the shelves was more of a visual thing. They looked empty, but that's just because there weren't enough workers to move it from the back of the store to the front of the store for the most part. So that was just sort of fascinating to watch in real time, Texas versus France or United States versus France on shopping behaviors.
You know, that's a great example of what the entrepreneurial people would call primary research result. You know, you think you understand it from the outside, but when you dig in the details, you know, it's not what you think.
Yeah, and I would just say, I mean, again, the San Antonio Food Bank, we're procuring food literally from the field to the fork. So every link of the food chain, if you will, we've got strategy to work with farmers and growers to get crops, you know, food manufacturers, wholesalers, great grocery retailers, obviously here, HEB, wonderful partners, but food service, restaurants, hotels, caterers. We work with land management for you know, wild game. And most people know their food bank because of a food drive, donating a non-perishable food, yet more than half of what we distribute is refrigerated and frozen. At the onset of COVID-19, restaurants, hotels, caterers, I'd say that's another US phenomenon, is the dependency on eating out. You know, we have so much food that's consumed in food service, and COVID shut that down, which for us at the food bank meant we were getting less donations. Retailers then, grocery stores, were really selling it at an efficiency, because that shift moved those customers into the grocery stores, which accelerated the pace. And as Michael said, they just struggled to keep up. There was some pivoting going on in the food industry. Those that sold their products to food service now were going to retail, which again, for us, meant grocery stores were selling out of things that we would generally pick up. At the same time, our demand was doubling, as many food banks across the country were seeing. And so there was a gap back in kind of March, April, first part of May, that was pretty scary, because we were worried we would run out of food. There were more withdrawals at the food bank than there were deposits. And so we've been able to stabilize and get into a rhythm, but I think learning about, you know, what can we do to prevent that? I think strategically that JIT, just-in-time inventory, and much more fresh fruits and vegetables. I don't know that there is a silver lining in COVID. I think it's been devastating to jobs and lives, and my heart breaks for every family that's lost a loved one. But it has made us slow down, and I think we have probably been around our own dinner tables more frequently in COVID than we were. And I think that's a good thing. I think when families are preparing food at home and together, that strengthens much more than just the body, but the spirit and the soul and minds of our residents. So we need to do more.
Yes, thank you, Eric. Well, I think we're a little over time, so I think that we're going to have to wrap it up today. But I would like to thank all of our panelists for joining us for this really fantastic discussion. It was really amazing to hear from each of you on this topic, which, as we've seen, is just so important. So thank you, panelists. I also would like to thank our sponsors and our partners for making today's event possible. And then finally, and most importantly, I would like to thank everyone in our virtual audience for joining us today. I hope that you enjoyed the screening and the discussion as much as I did, and that it gave you some insights and ideas about growing solutions to food insecurities. So thank you all, and I hope you have a wonderful afternoon.